All right, so good morning or good evening, depending on where you are currently located. I'm really excited to share my work. Some of you in here may already know it or have seen me present something similar to this. So I'll just jump right into it. A little bit is known about the process that's involved in decision making during deception detection, and we tend to not really look at the actual process of it. But there are some things that researchers do know. So there is this consensus in the field that deception detection is complicated, right? Researchers have analyzed verbal and nonverbal behaviors, and they have found some differences between groups. But the evidence for these deception cues that distinguishes between the two veracity groups, such as plausibility, amount of details, and nervousness, they continue to be quite weak. So despite some of these advances, we continue to see this difficult rate of deception detection. It continues to be low. And we see this across different professions. We see it with lay people, we see it with police officers. But we do see these high confidence rates with officers that mean that their skills of deception detection don't align with what their actual skills are. And the other thing that we do know about deception detection is that people tend to believe others. They tend to have this truth bias. But overall, our knowledge of deception detection and the decision-making that's involved is actually quite limited. And so I ran a set of studies, but I'm only going to be talking about this particular study here. And it addresses one of the misconceptions about deception and its detection, sorry. This misconception is that decision-making is static. And I assume this, or I say this, because of the way that deception is typically assessed in the literature, and it's assessed with a post hoc decision. And I'll describe more on that because that will be my control condition. But basically in this study, we assessed whether observers' natural decision-making tendencies have been obscured by this nearly standard method of assessing deception detection in the literature. So we had a first phase and a second phase. In the first phase, we created videos, and one of them was in order to make people tell the truth, and the other one was for them to tell a lie. So in these innocuous videos, people were just kind of shown an office with normal office materials. So some papers, books, a map, an empty package. But in the suspicious video, some of these items were very slightly altered. So the map, where before I just had a couple of pictures, kind of touristy pictures of friends in locations on the map, now it had pictures of famous bridges. So we were trying to insinuate that there is some sort of a sinister plot to bomb a bridge with some of the items. So the other items that participants saw, and you don't see that obviously here in this little picture, but the picture zoomed in, the video, sorry, zoomed in into this various items. So the pages changed, and then there were blueprints of a bridge and plans. And then what you might spot, there's a bomb making manual and then an imitation pipe bomb. So all kinds of things that would be hard to lie about, hopefully. That was our hope. So I will go to, oh, sorry. Nope. Okay, so people in the innocuous condition were told to tell the truth about what they had seen. So to talk about a normal office setting. Whereas people in the suspicious condition were told to lie about what they had seen, but also say that they had seen a normal office setting. And so we used those videos in the next phase. So here we had 120 undergraduates, most of whom were female. And we used 10 videos out of those that we collected, sorry, 20 videos, 10 videos of lie tellers, 10 videos of truth tellers. And the average of the videos was quite long compared to, I think, most studies that I see. I wish it was shorter. And we had 3 conditions for the deception task. So we had participants come into the laboratory, and the first condition, they completed a typical deception detection task. So they came in, they watched a video, and at the end of each video, they were asked, do you think the person in the video was lying or telling the truth? And they did this 20 times. We also had a dynamic condition. And here's where the study's a little bit different. So participants saw, this is an example of what they saw. It's not exactly what they saw, but they saw the same video, and below it there was a scale, and they were able to slide the little cursor as many times as they wanted. And each time that they released their mouse click, a decision was registered. And they were trained on this at first. And what I mean by that is they got to watch a video and they were told slide it to the right, or to indicate truth, to indicate lie. And then they were told to practice to make several decisions as they viewed the video. So this was the second condition, and they did this for the 20 videos as well. And then we had a final condition that combined both of these. So as participants watched the video, they were able to make decisions. And this is an infinite amount of decisions, by the way, that they're able to make. And then once they viewed the video and made their decisions, at the end of the video, they made this typical post hoc decision. You know, was the person lying or telling the truth? So what did we find? I'll say it's not what we expected. So what we found when we looked at observer discrimination between liars and truth tellers is that people who watched or completed, the control task, so that's completing the post hoc decision, were much better at discriminating between liars and truth tellers than those who were told to make the dynamic decision. We also looked at, we had that combined condition where they got to do the two of them, and we thought this might be an interesting thing to look at. And we looked at discrimination here as well. Without breaking up our data into bins, which other researchers have done in the past, we looked at the first decision, as it's typically or sometimes called the bias, where we see the first decision, the last decision just before that final dichotomous decision. And as you see here, discrimination between liars and truth tellers is poor in both the first and the last decision, but in that final decision that mimics the post hoc decision, they have great discrimination between liars and truth tellers. And these are people that use the scale as well as the final decision. Then we also looked at bias. Again, as I mentioned, it's because sometimes we think that the first decision is related to bias. So here we found, again, that there was a truth bias in the control condition, and it's a typical finding that we find in deception detection research, but we found no bias in the dynamic condition. And then again, we broke it down by this combined condition. And again, we see that that final dichotomous decision, there we have a truth bias, but there is, again, no bias between, in the first and the last conditions. And so I wanted to create a little chart to show the differences and what we find and how this is different than typical deception detection studies. So although we saw what we didn't expect to see, and I will talk about that in the next slide, what I think about that and why that may have happened, I will talk about the things that we did notice and how they're different. So one of the things that was vastly different is the fact that typically when we do deception detection studies, we see one decision, right? It's that one post hoc decision, was the person lying or telling the truth? But when we assess deception like this and gave participants the option to make as many decisions as they wanted, we saw between 0 and 200 decisions. Some people were continuously making more and more decisions as they viewed the account, which is something that is not accounted for with the typical lie detection study. Next, typically we don't assess the time to first decision in static decision making, right? Whereas here we were able to assess it, and we see the incredible variation in times that people choose to before they make their first decision. So between 10 seconds and 188 seconds is how long people are sitting and waiting to make their first decision. But when we force people to only make one final dichotomous post hoc decision, we're taking away that variance, and perhaps that person who made an initial decision at 10 seconds may have changed their mind by the time they have viewed the entire length of the video. Next, here is just to highlight again the things that we found was how discrimination differed between the two. So in our typical lie detection studies, we find that that people are better able to discriminate between truth tellers and lie tellers. Whereas in dynamic decision making, we see it as equal, and this might be more similar to what is actually happening. And finally, we find a truth bias consistently in typical deception detection studies, but we don't see it here. And perhaps what I'm getting to is that the way that we are typically measuring deception detection is not consistent with how the deception detection process actually occurs, or how decision-making occurs. And so what we're doing next, because the results that we got were not as expected, and I would say the reason that the results that we got were unexpected was that we assessed dynamic decision-making in a dichotomous way. We had to somewhat dichotomize our data in order to be able to assess it and compare it to what we typically have. But I think that the data that we have is so rich, and if we would be able to assess the data dynamically, we would find such interesting information that would tell us more about the deception decision-making process. And so we have several studies that we're currently conducting in order to be able to further assess this and figure this out. So at first, we want to rule out any kind of anchoring effect, because the way that we conducted the study was we place the cursor in the middle and everybody started there. And we're wondering if that somehow impacted the fact that there were no differences. So we want to see what are the differences, if we take away the anchor, if we start on one side versus the other, how will participants use it? Next, we want to acknowledge that it may be valuable to have a not sure option also when using the scale, because we had to do sometimes participants marked very close to the 50. The scale behind the scenes is between 0 and 100, and sometimes participants marked it very close to 50, and we had to dichotomize it the way that we did. But who's to say that the difference between 49 and 51 was actually intended by the participants? So we have to acknowledge that there should be perhaps a not sure option. We also want to, and are currently working on, and have run several studies where we are upgrading the tools and creating an open source program. So it is already available for others to be able to use this dynamic decision-making process with their own stimuli. So we're upgrading the tools in order to be able to actually assess this data dynamically. And we're working on possible modeling techniques to be able to do that. But the goal overall is to be able to map out the decision-making process in order to get these predictions of lie detection decisions. And the ultimate goal is to actually examine these decisions dynamically, the way that they are being tested. Thank you so much for your time.